The silence in the grand archive of Xylos was a physical thing, a weight of dust motes and decaying paper that settled on Elian's shoulders, like a shroud. He moved between the towering shelves of data slates and cryo-preserved manuscripts, a ghost in his own life. Here, history was a catalogued and sanitized commodity, every life a line of code, every event a timestamp. His own history was a void, a scorched earth memory he tended to with a cocktail of state-sanctioned suppressants and a will of iron. The suppressants were a slow poison, dulling his senses, blurring the world into a grayscale watercolor, but they were necessary. They smothered the sweet, rain-touched scent of petrichor and ozone that marked him as an omega, a scent that was both his nature and his curse. It was the scent of a storm gathering on a dry horizon, a promise of life and chaos that he could not afford to unleash. In the sterile, ordered world of the consortium, chaos was a disease, and omegas like him were its most potent vectors, to be controlled, catalogued, or erased. He had been all three. He ran a gloved finger along a row of slate spines, the cold, smooth surfaces a familiar comfort. His job was simple: to restore corrupted data fragments, to piece together the fractured narratives of long-dead corporations and forgotten political dynasties. He was good at it. He understood fragmentation. He knew what it was to be a collection of broken pieces, held together by nothing more than the desperate hope that no one would look too closely. The bite mark on his neck, a pale, silvered scar hidden beneath the high collar of his archivist's tunic, was a constant, throbbing reminder of the piece of him that was not his own. It was a brand, a claim, an echo of a moment when his body had been seized by an agony so profound it had become a dark, ecstatic singularity. He remembered the blinding pain, the scent of winter air and forged steel, the crushing weight of a body far larger than his own. He remembered the low growl, a sound that vibrated through his bones and settled in his soul. He remembered the feeling of being seen, truly seen, for one terrifying, electrifying instant. But the Alpha who had claimed him, the one who had marked him as his own in that sterile white room under the cold gaze of consortium scientists, had never known his name. To him, Elian had been Asset 734, a test subject, a final trial for a new kind of weaponized bonding protocol. And after the trial was complete, after the bond had been successfully forged and measured, Elian had been designated for decommissioning, obsolete, a loose end. He had escaped, melting into the anonymous, teeming underbelly of the capital city, armed with nothing but a forged identity chip and the ghost of a connection to a man who would not even remember his face. He had learned that the Alpha, a high-ranking commander in the consortium's elite enforcer division, had his memory of the project wiped clean. Standard procedure, they called it, to ensure operational focus, to prevent emotional compromise. The Alpha would remember nothing. Not the room, not the test, not the bite. Except, Elian knew, that wasn't entirely true. A bond, once forged, was not a line of code that could be deleted. It was a living thing, a psychic filament that stretched across space and time. The Alpha may have forgotten the what and the why, but the who was now a part of him, a phantom limb, a scent he would recognize in his sleep. And that was what terrified Elian most. Not that the Alpha would hunt him, but that he would simply stumble upon him, a forgotten ghost from a past he couldn't access, that he would smell the rain on the air and feel a flicker of recognition, a sense of belonging he could not explain. The thought sent a tremor through him, a cold dread that no suppressant could fully numb. He paused his work, leaning his forehead against the cool metal of the shelf. He closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, a name he whispered to himself in the dark, a small, desperate act of defiance against the void. He was a man who loved the smell of old books and the taste of synth ale on a cold night. He was a man who dreamed of seeing a real ocean, not just the shimmering holograms that decorated the plazas of the upper city. He was a man, and he was terrified that the one being in the universe who was biologically bound to him would look at him with the cold, empty eyes of a stranger. The chime of the archive's great clock echoed through the hall, signaling the end of his shift. He gathered his things, pulling his collar higher, ensuring the scar was completely hidden. He walked through the echoing halls, his footsteps silent on the polished floors. A man meticulously erasing himself from the world, praying he had done it well enough. He stepped out into the perpetual twilight of the lower city, the air thick with the smells of street food, exhaust fumes, and damp concrete. He pulled the hood of his cloak over his head, a faceless shape in a sea of millions, and began the long walk home, the ghost of a winter scent chasing him through the labyrinthine streets. He was a fragment, a corrupted file, and he feared, with every fiber of his being, that his restorer was coming. He didn't want to be pieced back together. He just wanted to be left in pieces, forgotten and safe. But the universe, he was beginning to understand, had a cruel sense of narrative cohesion. And the bond, the damned, unbreakable bond, was humming with a low, resonant frequency. A string pulled taut across the city, vibrating with the approach of the one person who could either save him or shatter him completely. Commander Kalen Var stood on the observation deck of the Enforcer headquarters, a spire of black glass and steel that pierced the toxic clouds shrouding the upper city. Below him, the metropolis sprawled like a glittering circuit board, its light lanes a complex network of pulsing energy. He was a figure carved from granite and discipline, his uniform immaculate, his posture a study in rigid control. His face, handsome in a severe, angular way, was a mask of professional calm, but behind his cool silver eyes a storm was brewing. For 3 years he had been haunted. It was not a memory, for his memory was flawless, regularly scanned and certified by consortium psych techs. It was a scent, a ghost on the edge of his perception. Petrichor and ozone, the smell of a coming storm, of dry earth meeting the first drops of rain. It came to him in his sleep, in the sterile silence of his quarters, in the heat of battle. It was a scent that promised something he couldn't name, a deep, primal ache for a place or a person he had never known. It was a flaw in his otherwise perfect system, a ghost in his machine, and he hated it. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Ava Rostova, approached, her footsteps crisp and precise. "Sir, the briefing for Operation Nightfall is ready." Kalen turned from the window, the city's lights reflecting in his eyes like captured stars. "Give me the summary, Lieutenant." Eva was all efficiency, her face impassive. Designation: Asset 734, an Omega from the now-defunct Asset Integration Program, believed to have escaped decommissioning 3 years ago. Our intelligence places him somewhere in the lower sectors of Xylos. He is a high-value target, sir. He possesses a unique biological signature and was bonded under experimental protocol. Director Valerius wants him retrieved. intact. Kalen's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The Asset Integration Program. The name was a blank slate in his mind, one of the countless black box projects the consortium ran. He had been on off-world campaigns during most of its operational years. Why the high priority after 3 years of silence? Ava's gaze didn't flicker. The asset's sent signature was flagged by a deep network atmospheric sensor an hour ago, near Sector Gamma 7. It's the first confirmed trace we've had since his escape. Director Valerius believes he may be destabilizing. An unsuppressed omega of his profile could trigger significant civic disruption. His heat cycle, if it manifests, could be potent. Kalen nodded, his mind already processing tactical approaches. Gamma 7, a maze of slums and black markets. And this experimental protocol? Rostova hesitated for a fraction of a second. The files are heavily redacted, sir. Level 10 clearance. All it says is Forge Bond Protocol. The alpha involved is listed as classified. The asset is considered uniquely receptive. His bond is theorized to be unusually strong. A strange, cold feeling washed over Kalen. A faint, almost subliminal echo of something he couldn't grasp. The scent of ozone seemed to thicken in the air around him. He dismissed it as a trick of his mind, a psychosomatic response to the mission parameters. Understood. Assemble my team. We move out at 2200. Yes, Commander. Eva turned to leave, but paused. Sir, a personal note from the director. She handed him a sealed data slate. Kalen took it, his fingers brushing hers. The slate was cold, inert. He waited until she was gone before breaking the seal. Director Valerius's face appeared, a hologram of calm, patriarchal authority. His voice was smooth, cultured, the kind of voice that could order an execution and then inquire about dinner. Commander Var, a word of caution on this assignment. Asset 734 is more than just a rogue Omega. He is a living record of a program we have since evolved beyond. His retrieval is a matter of historical sanitation. More importantly, the Forge Bond Protocol was designed to create an almost unbreakable psychic and biological link. The asset will feel your approach, Commander, just as you, on some level, might feel his. Do not mistake this echo for sentiment. It is a tool, a tracking device embedded in your very DNA. Use it. Find him. Bring him home. Valerius out. The hologram vanished, leaving Kalen alone in the silent room. A tracking device embedded in his DNA. The words chilled him. The ghost scent. It wasn't a phantom. It was a signal. He was a bloodhound, and for 3 years he hadn't even known he was on the hunt. He felt a surge of something cold and sharp, not quite anger, but a profound sense of violation. His own biology, his very instincts, had been weaponized without his knowledge. He looked down at his hands, turning them over. They were instruments of the consortium's will, tools of order and control. But for the first time, he felt like a tool in a way that was deeply, personally unsettling. The scent of rain and electricity filled his senses, stronger now than ever before. It was coming from the slate, a residual trace left by the director, a primer for the hunt. It wasn't a memory. It was a leash. He clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking in the silence. He was not a dog. He was a commander. He would find this asset. He would retrieve him as ordered. But he would also find answers. He would tear apart the classified files and find the name of the Alpha who had been used in this Forge Bond protocol. He would uncover the truth of what had been done to the asset and to him. He was a man of order, and this loose end, this ghost in his system, was a form of chaos he could not tolerate. He strode out of the room, his long coat swirling behind him, his face a mask of cold resolve. He was going to hunt a ghost, and he had the unsettling feeling that the ghost was a part of himself. The rain began to fall in Sector Gamma 7, not the clean, life-giving rain of Elian's scent, but a dirty, acidic drizzle that hissed on the hot pavement and drew a foul chemical stench from the gutters. Elian hurried through the labyrinth of narrow alleyways, his small apartment a sanctuary just a few blocks away. The suppressants were wearing thin today, the edges of his senses sharpening, colors seeming brighter, sounds louder, smells more potent. The chemical rain, the rotting refuse, the cheap synth noodles from a street vendor. It was all an assault, and beneath it all a new scent, faint but growing stronger, cold and sharp, winter air, forged steel, a scent that didn't belong in the humid decay of the lower city, a scent that belonged to the sterile heights of the Enforcer Spire, a scent that belonged to him. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Elian. It was a phantom, a trick of his fraying nerves. It had to be. He hadn't left his sector in months. He had been meticulous, careful, a ghost. But the feeling, the low hum of the bond, a vibration deep in his bones, was undeniable. It was no longer a distant echo. It was a clear, resonant tone. He was close. He was here. Elian broke into a run, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dodged through the crowds, a small, frantic figure in the teeming river of humanity. He had to get home. He had to take another dose of suppressants to bury himself so deep the scent would never escape. He had to disappear all over again. He rounded a corner, skidding on the wet ground, and slammed directly into a solid wall of a person. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his hood falling away. He looked up, his breath stolen from his lungs, his eyes wide with terror. He was staring up at a man who was the very architect of his nightmares, Commander Kalen Var. He was even larger in person than in Elian's fragmented memories, a towering figure in a severe, black enforcer coat, the rain beading on the waterproof fabric. His face was all harsh angles and cold authority, his silver eyes shockingly bright in the neon-drenched gloom. And for a horrifying, heart-stopping second, those eyes met his. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. The cacophony of the street faded into a dull roar. In that instant, Kalen's expression shifted. The professional mask faltered. A flicker of confusion, of profound, visceral shock crossed his features. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. It was the scent, the rain, the ozone. Elian smelled it on himself, a sudden, traitorous bloom of fragrance released by his panic. And Kalen smelled it too. He didn't recognize Elian's face. He didn't know his name, but he knew the scent. Elian saw it in his eyes, the dawning, instinctual recognition that bypassed memory and logic entirely. It was the look of a man hearing a forgotten song from his childhood, a melody that resonated in his soul without context or name. Elian's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment he had dreaded for 3 years, the collision of his past and present. Without a thought, he turned and fled, shoving his way blindly through the crowd. Wait! The voice was a low command, a deep baritone that cut through the noise and vibrated through the bond, a physical pull on his very being. It was the same voice that had growled in his ear in that white room. Kalen didn't know why he called out. He was on a mission, scanning the crowds for any sign of his target, when the scent hit him. Not the faint, primed trace from the data slate, but the real thing. overwhelming, intoxicating, a tidal wave of petrichor and ozone that drowned out the filth of the city. It was coming from the small, hooded figure he had collided with, a boy, an Omega, with wide, terrified eyes the color of warm honey. The moment their eyes met, something inside Kalen fractured, a sense of homecoming, a ridiculous, illogical, unprofessional feeling. It was the asset. It had to be. But the director's briefing hadn't prepared him for this. It hadn't prepared him for the raw, magnetic pull, the instinct that screamed mine in the deepest recesses of his alpha brain. He watched the Omega flee, and his training took over. He was a hunter, and his prey was escaping. But another part of him, a part he didn't recognize, wasn't hunting. It was reaching. He pushed through the crowd, his movements fluid and powerful, never losing sight of the small, dark-clad figure. The Omega was fast, agile, moving through the labyrinthine streets with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. Kalen followed, the scent a brilliant, shining thread in the sensory chaos of the slum. He wasn't just tracking a target. He was being pulled by an invisible force, the psychic filament of the Forge bond. He could feel the Omega's panic, a frantic, buzzing terror that echoed in his own chest. It was disorienting, invasive. He was feeling the emotions of his target. He rounded a corner into a deserted side alley, the Omega trapped against a high, graffiti-covered wall. The boy, he looked so young, was panting, his body trembling, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. He had cornered his prey. Elian's back hit the cold, wet brick of the dead-end alley. There was nowhere else to run. He turned, his chest heaving, to face the commander. The Alpha stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the neon glow of the main street, a figure of immense, inescapable power. The scent of winter and steel was overpowering now, a clean, cold fragrance that paradoxically made Elian's head spin with a strange, traitorous heat. The suppressants were failing, catastrophically. Kalen took a slow step forward, his silver eyes fixed on Elian, his expression unreadable. "I am Commander Kalen Var of the Consortium Enforcers," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a low, resonant authority that made the hairs on Elian's arms stand up. "You are to come with me." Elian shook his head, pressing himself harder against the wall, as if he could merge with the brick and disappear. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Leave me alone." Kalen took another step. The proximity was making the bond sing, a high, keening note in Elian's mind. He could feel the Alpha's confusion, his discipline warring with a powerful, disorienting instinct. He could feel the question in the Alpha's mind. "Who are you? Why do I know you?" "My orders are to retrieve you," Kalen stated, his voice tight. He was fighting it, fighting the pull. "Do not make this difficult." He reached a hand out, not to grab, but almost as if to check if Elian were real. The gesture, so strangely hesitant for a man of his authority, broke something in Elian. The fear, the years of repression, the agony of being forgotten, all of it coalesced into a single, sharp point of defiance. "You don't even know my name," he spat, the words laced with a bitterness that surprised even himself. Kalen froze, his hand hovering in the space between them. The statement hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was true. He was here to apprehend a being who felt inexplicably like a part of his own soul, and he didn't know his name. All he had was a designation number, Asset 734. The word felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at the Omega, truly looked at him. the defiant terror in his honey-colored eyes, the faint tremor of his lips, the pale silver scar just visible above the collar of his tunic. A claim mark, his claim mark. The phantom ache in his jaw flared into a sudden, sharp pain. He had done that. He had marked this boy, and he didn't remember it. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut. The director's words echoed in his mind. A tracking device embedded in your very DNA. He wasn't just a hunter. He was the weapon that had first wounded this creature, and he had been ordered to do it all over again. The silence in the alley stretched taut, thick with the smell of rain and the unspoken history that hung between them. Kalen slowly lowered his hand, his mind reeling. The Omega's words, "You don't even know my name," had bypassed his training, his conditioning, and struck something far deeper. It was an accusation that resonated with the formless guilt he'd carried for 3 years. The ghost scent, the phantom ache, it all began to coalesce into a terrible, nascent understanding. He had been a part of this. He hadn't just been assigned to hunt a ghost. He had helped create it. He looked at the claim mark on the Omega's neck, a delicate tracery of silvered tissue against pale skin. His own teeth had made that mark. The instinct to claim, to possess, was a primal part of his alpha nature, but it was always tempered by conscious choice, by respect, by emotion. To have done it without memory, as a mere function of an order, felt like a desecration of his own being. Kalen started, his voice losing its commanding edge, becoming something rougher, more uncertain. The files were redacted. It was a weak excuse, and he knew it. It sounded like the pathetic justification of a functionary, not a commander. Elian let out a short, bitter laugh that was closer to a sob. Redacted. Of course, why would a commander need to know the name of an asset? Asset 734. That's what I was. Am I still? The words were daggers, and they found their mark. Kalen flinched. The designation felt obscene now, looking at the terrified, defiant person in front of him. A wave of heat rolled off the Omega, a sudden, intense spike in his scent. The petrichor and ozone intensified, laced with a new note of feverish sweetness. Panic. His body was reacting to the proximity of his bonded alpha, the suppressants overwhelmed by the stress and the raw power of the connection. His heat was coming. Elian gasped, his legs suddenly weak. A dizzying, slick heat was pooling in his belly, a fire he hadn't felt in 3 years. The suppressants had held it at bay. But this, the shock, the fear, the sheer overwhelming presence of the alpha who had marked him, it was shattering his control. He could feel his own scent glands weeping the fragrant oil of his preheat, a desperate, involuntary signal to his bonded alpha. Here. I am here. Help me. Claim me. He hated it. He hated his own body for betraying him, for crying out for the very man who was his jailer. He slid down the wall, his knees giving out, landing in a crouch on the wet, grimy pavement. Kalen's own instincts roared to life in response. The sweet, feverish scent of a coming heat, his Omega's heat, was a siren call that bypassed all logic. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary, protective sound. His orders were to retrieve the asset. But every fiber of his being was screaming to protect him, to soothe him, to get him somewhere safe and warm and build a nest for him. The conflict was a physical agony, a tearing sensation in his mind. Duty versus instinct. The consortium versus the bond. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over Elian. He shrugged off his long, heavy enforcer coat and draped it over the Omega's trembling shoulders. It was a purely instinctual act. The coat was saturated with his own scent, winter air and steel, and he knew, on a level he didn't understand, that it would help. It would soothe the Omega's panic and mask his blooming heat scent from any other alphas in the vicinity. Elian flinched at the contact, but the weight of the coat was surprisingly comforting. The alpha's scent, so terrifying moments before, now wrapped around him like a protective shield, calming the frantic edges of his panic. It was confusing, disorienting. The source of his terror was now offering him comfort. He looked up at Kalen through his lashes, his honey-colored eyes shimmering with unshed tears and the fever of his impending heat. Kalen crouched down in front of him, bringing them eye to eye. The difference in their size was still immense, but the gesture was one of equality, not dominance. "I am not going to hurt you," Kalen said, his voice low and intense. "But we cannot stay here. Your scent. It will draw attention. My orders are to take you in, but I will not take you back to them, not to the labs." It was a vow, spoken with a conviction that startled him. He was committing treason. He was defying a direct order from Director Valerius, for an Omega whose name he didn't know, for a scent that had haunted him, for a wrong he was only just beginning to comprehend. Elian stared at him, searching his face for deceit. He saw none. He saw conflict, confusion, and a startlingly raw protectiveness. He saw the man, not the commander. The bond between them hummed, no longer a signal of dread, but a low, resonant chord of something else. Trust was too strong a word, but it was a start. "Where?" Elian whispered, his voice barely audible. "My apartment," Kalen said, the decision solidifying in his mind. "It's a secure location, the highest level of clearance. No one will find you there. We can figure this out." "We." The word hung in the air between them. "Not I will figure this out. We." Kalen's comm unit chirped in his ear. It was Lieutenant Rostova. "Commander, what is your status? We've lost your signal. Do you have eyes on the asset?" He ignored it. He reached out, slowly, and gently touched Elian's arm. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure energy shot through the bond. A shared shock that made them both gasp. It felt like closing a circuit. For 3 years, they had been two halves of a broken whole. Now, they were connected. Kalen could feel the feverish heat under Elian's skin, the frantic fluttering of his pulse. Elian could feel the solid, steady strength of the alpha, the deep well of bewildered protectiveness directed at him. "Can you stand?" Kalen asked, his voice softer than Elian had ever imagined it could be. Elian nodded, his legs still shaky. With Kalen's hand firmly on his arm, he managed to get to his feet, pulling the huge coat tighter around himself. It smelled of Kalen. It smelled like safety. It was the most confusing feeling in the world. "Rostova," Kalen said into his comm, his voice once again the crisp, authoritative commander. "False alarm. The atmospheric sensor must have malfunctioned. The signature has dissipated. I'm returning to my vehicle." "But sir," Eva's voice was laced with confusion. "Our readings showed—" "The readings were incorrect, Lieutenant," Kalen cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stand down. That's an order." He deactivated the comm before she could reply. He had just lied to his most trusted subordinate. He had just declared a ghost a hallucination, while the ghost himself stood shivering in his coat. He looked at Elian, whose face was pale in the gloom, his eyes wide and luminous. The first battle was over. He had chosen the Omega over the consortium. Now the war had just begun. "Come with me," he said, his voice gentle. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and started walking out of the alley, his pace slow, expecting Elian to follow. And Elian, wrapped in the scent of his long-lost alpha, his body succumbing to a heat he could no longer fight, took a shaky breath and followed the commander into the unknown. He was walking toward the man who had broken him, praying he was also the man who could make him whole. Kalen's apartment was a world away from the grime of Sector Gamma 7. Located at the apex of the Enforcer Spire, it was a space of minimalist, brutalist elegance, polished concrete floors, vast panoramic windows showcasing the glittering expanse of the upper city, and furniture that was more sculpture than comfort. It was sterile, silent, and cold, a reflection of the man who lived there, or at least the man Kalen had been until an hour ago. He led Elian inside, the door hissing shut behind them, sealing them in a bubble of pressurized silence. The transition was jarring. Elian, still wrapped in the commander's coat, looked small and out of place, a fragile organic thing in a world of chrome and glass. The fever from his encroaching heat was making him unsteady. His cheeks flushed, his eyes bright and unfocused. He swayed on his feet, and Kalen was instantly at his side, a steadying hand on his back. The heat radiating from him was intense. "You need to lie down," Kalen said, his voice tight with a concern that was entirely new to him. He led Elian toward the bedroom, a space even more Spartan than the living area, dominated by a low, wide bed with plain grey sheets. Elian sank onto the edge of the mattress, the coat pooling around him. He was trembling, a fine tremor that shook his entire frame. The bond was a roaring inferno in his mind now, the proximity to his alpha amplifying his body's reactions exponentially. He could smell Kalen everywhere, on the coat, in the air, emanating from the man himself, and his Omega instincts, so long suppressed, were screaming, "Nest, safe, mate." He curled in on himself, clutching the coat, trying to fight the overwhelming urge to burrow into the blankets and surround himself with the alpha's scent. Kalen watched him, a war raging inside him. His alpha instincts were a howling storm, demanding he go to the Omega, comfort him, scent him, see him through his heat. His training was a cold, hard wall, screaming that this was a compromised situation, that the asset was a security risk, that he was losing control, and beneath both was a third voice, a human voice, filled with a profound, aching guilt. He had done this. The state Elian was in, the terror, the fever, it was all a consequence of an order he had followed, an action he had performed and been forced to forget. He walked over to a sterile cabinet on the wall and keyed in a code. A drawer slid open, revealing medical supplies. He pulled out a fever reducer and a hydration pack. Basic field medic training. But this wasn't a wounded soldier. This was something else. He knelt in front of Elian, holding out a water pouch. "Drink this." Elian looked at him, his eyes hazy. He took the pouch with a shaking hand. What is this?" he whispered. "What are you doing?" Kalen's gaze was steady, his silver eyes holding a universe of conflict. "I'm trying to fix a mistake." He paused, the words costing him. My mistake. The admission hung in the air, more shocking than any order. Elian drank the water, the cool liquid a small relief against the fire in his throat. He watched the commander, this man of ice and authority, who now looked as lost as he felt. "They'll come for you," Elian said, his voice weak. "When they know you lied, they'll come for both of us." "Let them," Kalen said, the words sharp as broken glass. "I have to know. The Asset Integration Program. The Forge Bond Protocol. I have to know what they did. To you. To me." He stood up and walked over to a terminal in the corner of the room. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, his personal clearance codes granting him access to the highest levels of the Enforcer network. He began to dig. He started with his own service record, cross-referencing dates with the known operational window of the Asset Integration Program. He found it. A 3-week period, 3 years ago, listed as Specialized Training and Evaluation at a remote facility, Substation Epsilon. The entire entry was flagged with a Level 10 security protocol. No details, no mission logs, just a blank space, a memory hole. Using his command override, he began to peel back the layers of encryption. It was like breaking into a fortress. Firewalls fought him. Security demons tried to lock him out, but he was relentless, using every backdoor and exploit he knew. While Kalen worked, Elian succumbed to a wave of feverish exhaustion. He curled up on the bed, still wrapped in the coat, and drifted into a restless, heat-laced sleep. His dreams were a torrent of fragmented memories. The white room, the cold eyes of the scientist behind reinforced glass, the scent of antiseptic and fear. And then the Alpha. He remembered being strapped to a medical table, his body pliant with Omega-specific sedatives. He remembered the door sliding open and the commander walking in, his face an impassive mask, his silver eyes cold and distant. He was just following an order. Elian knew that even then. He could feel the Alpha's own rigid control, the iron discipline holding his instincts in check. He remembered the scientist's voice over the intercom, clinical and detached. "Commander, initiate the bond. We are monitoring the subject's physiological and psychic response." He remembered the commander approaching, the scent of winter and steel filling his senses, a clean, sharp fragrance in the sterile room. He had looked down at Elian, and for a moment, just a flicker, the mask had slipped. He saw a flash of something. Reluctance, pity. It was gone as quickly as it came. He had leaned down, his hand gently but firmly tilting Elian's head to the side, exposing the sensitive skin of his neck. Elian remembered the low growl, the one he'd heard again in the alley, a sound of pure, primal instinct that the commander was clearly fighting to suppress. And then, the pain, blinding, exquisite, all-consuming, the feeling of teeth sinking into his flesh, marking him, claiming him. But through the agony, there was something else, a flood of sensation through the nascent bond. He felt the commander's own disciplined loneliness, a profound, aching isolation that mirrored his own. He felt the man's rigid control, the immense effort it took to be the perfect soldier. In that moment of forced intimacy, of violence and violation, he had seen the soul of the man who was breaking him. And then the drugs had taken him, pulling him under into a black, dreamless void. "I found it." Kalen's voice, sharp and strained, pulled Elian from the dream. He opened his eyes. The room was dark, save for the glow of the holographic screen, which illuminated the commander's stark profile. His face was pale, his expression one of dawning horror. On the screen, a file was open. It was heavily corrupted, large blocks of data missing, but some fragments remained. Subject, Asset 734. Species. Designation, Omega, Male Protocol, Forge Bond, Final Trial. Objective, test psychic resilience and biological compatibility of bond under forced conditions. Alpha Operative. Commander Kalen Var. Post-trial directive. Alpha Memory Wipe. Standard procedure. Asset decommissioning. Kalen stared at the screen, his own name a damning indictment. It was him. He was the classified Alpha. He had not just been used as a tracking dog, he had been the tool of the initial trauma. He remembered nothing of it. A 3-week hole in his life. They had taken his memory, stolen a piece of his history, and used his body to perform this violation. He felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of pure, cold rage. A rage directed not at the Omega, but at the system he had served his entire life. At Director Valerius, with his calm voice and sanitized justifications. He looked over at Elian, who was now sitting up, watching him, his eyes knowing. He had known all along. "You knew," Kalen whispered, the words catching in his throat. Elian simply nodded, pulling the coat tighter. "I remembered," he said softly. "For both of us." Kalen turned back to the screen, his hands clenched into fists. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. The words Elian had whispered to himself in the archive now echoed in Kalen's own mind. And this boy, this Omega, he was not an asset either. He was a person whose life he had irrevocably broken, on orders he couldn't even remember. He scrolled down, his fingers shaking slightly. He found another fragment, a name buried under lines of corrupted code. Asset Birth Registry Designation. Elian. His name was Elian. Kalen spoke it aloud, the name a strange and holy thing on his tongue. Elian. The sound of his own name, spoken by this man, sent a shiver through Elian that had nothing to do with fever. It was the first time the commander had ever said it. It was the first time he had been acknowledged as a person by the Alpha who wore his mark. The bond between them shifted, a subtle but seismic change. The raw, instinctual pull was still there, but now it was threaded with something new. Recognition, a name, a beginning. Kalen turned away from the screen, his face a mask of anguish and resolve. He crossed the room and knelt before Elian again, the powerful commander, on his knees before the broken asset. "Elian," he said again, his voice thick with a guilt so profound it was a physical weight. "They took my memory. But that's not an excuse. What I did—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elian looked into his silver eyes, seeing past the commander, past the Alpha, to the man inside, who was just as fractured as he was. "You were a weapon," Elian whispered. "And I was the target. We were both just tools." Kalen reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently, reverently, touched the scar on Elian's neck. His fingers were warm against Elian's feverish skin. The touch was not one of ownership, but of apology, of shared pain. "No more," Kalen vowed, his voice a low growl of promise. "No more tools, no more assets." He looked from the scar to Elian's eyes. "They will answer for this. I swear it." In the sterile silence of the Enforcer's spire, surrounded by the cold symbols of power and control, something new was being forged. Not a bond of violence and obedience, but one of shared defiance. The hunter had just sworn to protect his prey, and in doing so, had declared war on his masters. The next few hours passed in a feverish, surreal haze. Elian's heat, triggered by the shock and the overwhelming proximity to his bonded Alpha, crashed over him in relentless waves. The sterile, minimalist bedroom became a crucible. The air thick with the scent of a summer storm and the clean, cold fragrance of winter. Kalen, guided by an instinct he was only just beginning to accept, moved with a quiet, focused intensity. He was no longer the conflicted commander. He was an alpha tending to his mate. He brought cool cloths for Elian's forehead, held water to his lips, and murmured low, soothing words that were more sound than sense, a continuous rumble of reassurance that vibrated through the bond and calmed the frantic edges of Elian's delirium. He did not touch him, not in the way Elian's fevered body craved. He respected the invisible boundary, understanding that this was not a heat of passion, but of trauma and sickness. His presence alone was both the cause of the fire and the only thing that could keep it from consuming Elian completely. Elian drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between the present and the past. At times, he would look up and see Kalen's concerned face, his silver eyes dark with guilt, and a strange sense of safety would wash over him. At other times, the face would blur, replaced by the memory of the cold, impassive mask from the laboratory, and he would flinch away, whimpering. Through it all, Kalen remained, a steady, unmovable presence. He had stripped off his uniform jacket, wearing only a simple black shirt that clung to his powerful frame. He had abandoned the rigid posture of the commander, his movements now fluid and responsive, entirely focused on Elian's needs. He was watching a man unravel because of something he had done, and the sight was forging a new kind of discipline in him, the discipline of atonement. During a moment of lucidity, Elian's gaze fell on the commander's arm. On the black fabric, he noticed a small, embroidered patch he hadn't seen before, the insignia of Kalen's elite unit, the Nightfall cohort, but beneath it, almost invisible, was another mark, a tiny silver scar, no bigger than a thumbnail, right on his wrist. It was an Omega's bite mark, faded, almost gone, but unmistakable. Elian stared at it, his fever-addled mind struggling to process the information. Kalen noticed his gaze. He instinctively moved to cover the mark, a flicker of old pain crossing his face. "A training accident," he said, his voice clipped. "A long time ago." But Elian, his senses heightened by the heat, could feel the lie through the bond. It wasn't an accident. It was a loss, a profound, deep-seated grief that Kalen kept locked away, even from himself. He had been bonded before, and that bond had been broken. The realization shifted something in Elian. It didn't excuse what Kalen had done, but it contextualized it. The commander's disciplined loneliness, the profound isolation Elian had felt from him in the lab. It wasn't just the life of a soldier. It was the echo of a shattered bond. This man of steel and ice had once loved and lost in the most primal way an alpha could. And the consortium had taken that broken, grieving man and pointed him at Elian like a loaded gun. The anger Elian felt towards him began to soften, replaced by a complex, aching pity that was mirrored by the guilt he felt from Kalen. They were two sides of the same coin, both scarred by a system that treated hearts and souls as disposable parts. As dawn approached, the worst of the fever broke. Elian was left weak, slick with sweat, but clear-headed for the first time in hours. He was lying in Kalen's bed, the sheets tangled around him. Kalen was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the first grey light of dawn creep over the city. He looked exhausted, his face etched with strain, but his eyes were clear and resolved. "It's over," Elian whispered, his voice raspy. Kalen turned, his expression softening as he looked at him. "For now." He stood and walked to the bed, sitting on the edge. He no longer seemed like a towering, intimidating figure, but just a man, burdened and weary. "We need a plan," Kalen said. "Valerius will know I lied. He'll have put a trace on my comms, my vehicle. Rostova is loyal, but she is loyal to the consortium first. They will be hunting us both by now." "There's nowhere to go," Elian said, the old despair creeping back in. "The consortium is everywhere." "Not everywhere," Kalen countered. "There are the Outer Rim territories, unaffiliated worlds. It's dangerous, but it's free." He looked at Elian, his gaze intense. "But we can't get there without help. I have a contact, someone who operates outside the system, but reaching him will be difficult." His comm unit, which he had placed on the nightstand, suddenly chirped. Not with an incoming call, but with a system alert. Kalen snatched it up. His face went pale. "They've locked me out," he said, his voice grim. "My command codes, my clearances, all revoked. They've flagged me as a rogue operative." He looked at the window, at the sprawling city below. "They've just turned this apartment from a fortress into a cage." As if on cue, a low, deep hum resonated through the building. Red lights began to flash silently in the corners of the ceiling. "Building locked down," Kalen swore, grabbing his discarded uniform jacket and pulling a sidearm from a hidden holster. "They're sealing the spire. They'll be going floor by floor." Panic, cold and familiar, tried to grip Elian, but he pushed it down. He had survived 3 years on the run. He would not fall apart now. He slid out of bed, his legs still shaky, but his mind clear. He was weak, but he was not helpless. "The service conduits," Elian said, his archivist's knowledge of city infrastructure suddenly vital. "The major spires are all connected by a network of maintenance tunnels for droids. They're not on the main schematics." Kalen looked at him, a flicker of surprise and respect in his eyes. He had been so focused on protecting the asset that he had forgotten Elian was a survivor with his own skills, his own knowledge. "Show me," Kalen said, his voice once again the commander's, not of the consortium, but of their tiny, 2-person rebellion. Elian led him to a ventilation grate in the main living area. It was large, designed for industrial air scrubbers. Behind this, there should be a primary access shaft. Kalen didn't hesitate. He used the butt of his sidearm to break the magnetic lock, and together they pried the heavy grate open, revealing a dark, dusty shaft that dropped into blackness. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of ozone and machinery. "It will lead to the central nexus, 3 levels down," Elian explained, his voice steady. "From there, we can get to the lower levels and out of the building before they reach this floor." Kalen looked from the dark shaft to Elian. The Omega's face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were bright with intelligence and a fierce will to live. He was not a liability. He was a partner. "After you," Kalen said, a hint of a wry smile touching his lips for the first time. Elian slipped into the shaft, and Kalen followed, pulling the grate close behind them. They were plunged into near-total darkness, the only light the faint glow of emergency strips running along the walls of the conduit. The red flashing lights of the apartment were gone, the sterile silence replaced by the hum of the spire's hidden machinery. They had left the cage behind and entered the walls, becoming ghosts in the machine that was hunting them. As they began their descent, moving carefully through the cramped, dark space, the bond between them was a silent, steady presence. It was no longer a source of pain or confusion. It was a compass, a lifeline in the dark. Kalen could feel Elian's exhaustion, his fear, but also his steely resolve. Elian could feel Kalen's protective focus, his tactical mind mapping their path, and beneath it all, the deep, resonant hum of his guilt, now tempered with a new, fierce purpose. They were fugitives, hunted by the most powerful entity in the known worlds. But for the first time, they were not alone. They were in it together. And as they moved deeper into the city's hidden veins, a fragile, unspoken trust began to form, forged in the heat of a shared crisis and a shared enemy. The service conduits were a claustrophobic maze of pipes, wiring, and narrow catwalks, a metallic underworld beneath the spire's polished skin. The air was cold and recycled, the only sound the constant, low-frequency hum of the building's life support systems. Kalen led the way, his sidearm drawn, his senses on high alert. He moved with the practiced silence of a predator, his every step sure and deliberate. Elian followed close behind, his initial weakness giving way to a surge of adrenaline. His years of living in the shadows, of being hyper-aware of his surroundings, had honed his senses in a different way. He noticed the subtle shifts in airflow that signaled a junction, the faint vibrations in the catwalk that warned of a heavy maintenance droid approaching. Twice, he put a hand on Kalen's arm, pulling him into a dark alcove as a cleaning drone or a security bot whirred past, its optical sensors sweeping the main tunnel, oblivious to the two fugitives hidden just meters away. During one such pause, pressed close together in the darkness, Kalen glanced at him, his silver eyes reflecting the faint emergency light. "You're good at this," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Hiding." The words were a simple observation, but they held a universe of meaning. He was acknowledging Elian's past, his struggle, not as a weakness, but as a strength. "I had to be," Elian replied simply. The bond between them felt solid in the enclosed space, a tangible warmth against the cold metal. He could feel Kalen's admiration, a clean, sharp feeling that was a balm on his raw nerves. He could also feel the Alpha's constant, thrumming anger at the consortium, a controlled burn that fueled his focus. It was a righteous anger, an anger on Elian's behalf, and it was the most profoundly reassuring thing Elian had ever felt. "My contact," Kalen said, his voice barely audible over the hum. "His name is Silas. He's a data broker and a smuggler. He operates out of the old spaceport on the underside. If anyone can get us off-world without consortium clearance, it's him." "How do you know him?" Elian asked. Kalen hesitated, his gaze distant. "He helped me once, a long time ago, after the training accident." He didn't need to say more. Elian understood. Silas had helped Kalen when his first bond was broken. The man was a specialist in broken things. It made him the perfect ally. "He'll help," Kalen added, more to himself than to Elian. "He owes me." They reached the central nexus, a vast, cavernous space where conduits from all over the spire converged. It was a web of catwalks and platforms suspended in a dizzying void, the bottom lost in darkness. "The main transport elevators to the lower levels are on the far side," Elian pointed. "But they'll be monitored." Kalen scanned the area, his tactical mind assessing the situation. "We'll have to create a diversion." He pointed to a large power conduit running along the ceiling. "That's the primary feed for the lower-level security grid. If we can overload it, it will knock out their sensors and internal comms for a few minutes, long enough for us to get to an elevator and down to the underside." It was a risky plan. A power overload could trigger a catastrophic feedback loop, but it was their only chance. "I can do it," Elian said, surprising Kalen. My work in the archives, it wasn't just old books. I worked with power distribution grids for the cryostasis units. I know how to create a cascade failure without blowing up the whole sector. Kalen looked at him, a new level of respect dawning. This was not the terrified Omega from the alley. This was a man with skills, with courage. "All right," he said, handing Elian a small multi-purpose tool from his belt. "Tell me what to do." Working together, they shimmied up a support beam to the conduit. Elian, his fingers nimble and sure, directed Kalen, whose strength was needed to pry open the heavy access panels. The bond was an asset now, a silent, instantaneous form of communication. Elian would feel a surge of panic when Kalen touched the wrong wire, and Kalen would immediately pull back. Kalen would sense Elian's need for a specific tool, and it would be in his hand before Elian even asked. They worked in perfect, unspoken sync, two parts of a single organism. As Elian made the final connection that would start the overload sequence, he paused. "This will trigger every alarm in the spire," he said, looking at Kalen. "Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll know exactly where we are." Kalen's gaze was hard as granite. "I passed the point of no return when I walked into that alley, Elian." He said his name again, and the sound was a quiet vow. "When I chose you over them." Elian's heart stuttered. "Chose you." The words were a key, unlocking something deep inside him. He had spent his life being chosen for things, for the program, for decommissioning, for a life of hiding. He had never been chosen by someone. He nodded, his resolve hardening. He made the final connection. A low whine began to build from the conduit, the lights in the nexus flickering. "We have 90 seconds, Elian said, scrambling back down to the catwalk. They ran, a desperate, silent sprint across the swaying platforms. The whine grew to a piercing shriek, and then, with a deafening boom, the main lights went out, plunging them into absolute blackness. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing the nexus in the blood-red glow of backup lighting. Alarms began to blare throughout the spire, a chaotic symphony of their rebellion. They reached the elevator platform just as a squad of enforcers appeared on the far side, their armor stark silhouettes against the red light. "There," one of them shouted, raising his pulse rifle. Kalen pushed Elian behind him, returning fire with his sidearm. The shots were precise, aimed not to kill, but to disable, striking the enforcers' weapons and forcing them to take cover. "Get the door," Kalen yelled. Elian slammed his palm against the elevator's control panel. The doors slid open with agonizing slowness. They scrambled inside, and Elian hit the button for the lowest level, the underside. The doors began to close just as the enforcers opened fire again, pulse rounds sparking against the reinforced metal. The elevator dropped, a stomach-lurching plunge into the depths of the city. They were safe, for the moment. Inside the small, descending box, they stood in silence, the only sound their own ragged breaths and the scream of the alarms fading above them. Kalen automatically began reloading his weapon, his hands moving with efficient, practiced motions. Elian watched him, his heart still hammering. He looked at the powerful, dangerous man beside him, the Alpha, who had, without hesitation, shielded him with his own body. He thought of them working together on the conduit, a seamless partnership. He thought of Kalen saying his name. The terror he had lived with for 3 years was still there, a ghost in the back of his mind, but it was being eclipsed by a new, fragile emotion. Gratitude, and something more, a sense of belonging that was terrifying in its intensity. He reached out and, before he could second-guess himself, placed his hand on Kalen's arm. Kalen stopped reloading, his whole body going still. He looked down at the small hand on his arm, then up at Elian's face. Elian's honey-colored eyes were wide, luminous in the dim light, and held no trace of fear, only a deep, searching sincerity. "Thank you," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. Kalen's throat felt tight. He had been thanked for valor, for successful missions, for following orders. He had never been thanked for treason. He had never been thanked for choosing a person over the system. He slowly covered Elian's hand with his own. The contact was warm, solid. "I should have protected you then," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not going to fail you again." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors opened onto the underside, the lowest level of the city. The air that hit them was thick, humid, and alive with the smells of 1,000,000 unsanitized lives, of industry and decay and freedom. They stepped out of the sterile world of the consortium and into the chaos of the city's depths. They were still hunted, still running, but now they were running together. The underside was another city entirely, a chaotic, vibrant world thriving in the foundations of the pristine metropolis above. The sky was a ceiling of pipes and conduits dripping with condensation, the only light coming from a riot of neon signs, holographic advertisements, and the open flames of food stalls. The air was a thick soup of smells, exotic spices, ozone from faulty wiring, engine oil, and the overwhelming scent of unsuppressed people, a tapestry of alpha, beta, and omega pheromones that made Elian's head spin after years of sterile environments. It was overwhelming, but it was also alive. Here people weren't sanitized data points. They were messy, loud, and real. For Kalen, it was a tactical nightmare. Too many variables, too many places for an ambush, too little order. For Elian, it was strangely like coming home. This was the world that had hidden him, the anonymity of the crowd that had kept him safe. Kalen pulled the hood of a dark cloak he'd scavenged from an emergency locker over his head, his severe enforcer features too conspicuous here. Elian, still wearing Kalen's massive coat, blended in more easily, just another small figure wrapped against the perpetual damp. "The old spaceport is on the western edge," Kalen said, his voice low, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the small of Elian's back, a protective, grounding presence. "We move fast. They'll have dispatched teams down here by now." They plunged into the throng, moving with a shared purpose. Kalen's size and confident stride parted the crowd, while Elian's familiarity with the lower city's rhythms allowed him to navigate the shifting currents of people, guiding them through shortcuts and less traveled byways. The bond was a quiet hum between them, a constant reassurance. Kalen could feel Elian's sensory overload, the slight dizziness from the riot of smells, and he instinctively shielded him, his own scent of winter and steel a calming anchor in the chaos. Elian, in turn, could feel Kalen's tension, the way his eyes scanned every rooftop and alley, and he would subtly guide them toward more open, defensible paths. They were passing a darkened alley when a new scent cut through the miasma. Bitter herbs and something sharp, like burnt sugar. Suppressant blockers. Black market chemicals designed to forcefully induce a heat or rut. And with it, the scent of a terrified Omega. A cry of pain, quickly muffled, came from the darkness. Kalen's head snapped toward the sound. Duty and instinct warred in him for a split second. Their own lives were at stake. They couldn't afford to get involved. But then he felt a surge of fierce, protective anger through the bond. Not from himself, but from Elian. Elian had stopped, his face pale with fury. He knew that smell. He knew that fear. He looked at Kalen, his eyes blazing. We can't just leave them. Before Kalen could argue, Elian had turned and slipped into the alley. Swearing under his breath, Kalen followed. In the shadows, two brutish alphas had a young Omega cornered, trying to force a vial of the blocker into his hand. The Omega was fighting, but he was clearly outmatched. Seeing Elian and the towering shape of Kalen behind him, the two alphas snarled. "Mind your own business, slicker," one of them growled, his scent turning acrid and aggressive. Kalen didn't say a word. He simply let the hood of his cloak fall back, revealing his face. He didn't need to show a weapon. His eyes, cold and silver as a winter sky, and the sheer, disciplined killing intent that rolled off him in waves, were enough. He was no longer just an alpha. He was a commander of the Nightfall cohort, one of the most feared units in the consortium, and that training was etched into his very being. The two thugs froze, their bravado evaporating. They recognized the look of a true predator, a man who could kill them before they drew their next breath. They dropped the vial and scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness. The young Omega, who couldn't have been more than a teenager, stared at Kalen with wide, terrified eyes. Then at Elian. He was shaking, clutching a torn satchel to his chest. Elian stepped forward, his movements slow and non-threatening. He knelt down, ignoring the grime on the ground. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. The boy nodded, still too scared to speak. Elian picked up the dropped vial of blocker. "This stuff is poison," he said, his voice tight with anger. "It will tear your body apart." He looked at the boy's worn clothes, the desperation in his eyes. "You don't have to do this." "I have to," the boy whispered, finding his voice. "My family. We need the credits. A heat contract. It pays well." The words were a punch to the gut for Elian. He saw his own past, his own exploitation, reflected in this boy's desperation. The system wasn't just the consortium in its high towers. It was here, in the dirt, forcing people to sell their bodies, their very nature, to survive. Kalen watched the exchange, a muscle working in his jaw. He had spent his life keeping the peace, maintaining order. But he saw now that the order he had enforced was built on this kind of desperation. The peace was the quiet of the oppressed. He reached into a hidden pocket of his coat, the one Elian was wearing, and pulled out a credit chip. It was his emergency fund, a small fortune by underside standards. He held it out to the boy. "This is a better way," he said, his voice gruff. The boy stared at the chip, then at Kalen, his eyes filling with tears. I can't." "Take it," Kalen insisted. "Get your family somewhere safe. Get out of this city." The boy took the chip, his fingers trembling. He bowed his head low. "Thank you," he whispered, before turning and running, clutching the chip like the miracle it was. They were left alone in the alley. Elian stood up, turning to face Kalen. He looked at the alpha, at the man who had just given away his escape fund to help a stranger, the man who had faced down two thugs, not with violence, but with sheer, controlled presence. "That was," Elian began, struggling for words. "Everything you had," he finished softly. "We have nothing now." Kalen looked at him, his silver eyes unreadable in the gloom. "We don't have nothing," he said quietly. I have you. The words were spoken with a simple, profound sincerity that struck Elian to his core. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. It was a statement of fact, a statement of alliance, a statement of value. In Kaelin's new world, stripped of his rank, his clearances, his wealth, Elian was his only remaining asset. But the word asset had been transformed. It no longer meant property. It meant strength. A new sound cut through the night. The high-pitched whine of enforcer patrol drones. They had been found. They're canvassing the area street by street, Kaelin said, his hand going back to his weapon. We need to get off the main thoroughfares. Just then, a gruff voice called out from the deeper shadows of the alley. If you're looking to get out of the rain, you're attracting an awful lot of lightning. A large, burly figure emerged from a hidden doorway. A man with a thick grey beard and shrewd, intelligent eyes. He was wiping his hands on an oily rag. The scent of ozone and old machinery clung to him. Took you long enough to get here, Kaelin, the man said, a wry smile playing on his lips. I've been monitoring Enforcer comms since they locked down your pretty glass tower. Figured you might need a door. Kaelin relaxed visibly, holstering his weapon. Silas, he said, a note of relief in his voice. You haven't changed. Silas grunted, his eyes flicking to Elian, then back to Kaelin. His gaze was sharp, missing nothing. The expensive coat on the small Omega, the palpable bond between them, the exhaustion and desperation clinging to them both. Can't say the same for you, Silas observed. Last I saw you, you were the consortium's golden boy. Now you look like you've started a war. Kaelin's expression was grim. I have. Silas's smile widened. Good, he said, gesturing with the rag toward the open door. I hate being the only one. Get in. The drones are doing a biometric sweep on the next block. You've got about 2 minutes before this whole sector is crawling with tin soldiers. They ducked into the doorway, Silas sealing it behind them. They were in a cluttered workshop filled with the guts of scavenged technology. It smelled of solder and secrets. Silas looked them both over. So, he said, his eyes twinkling with a dangerous curiosity. Tell me everything. The war had its first ally. Silas's workshop was a hoarder's paradise of scavenged tech and repurposed machinery, a testament to a life lived in the cracks of the system. Holographic projectors lay disassembled next to Starship navigation arrays, and the air hummed with the energy of a dozen half-finished projects. Silas poured them a cup of a bitter, steaming beverage that tasted vaguely of roasted grain and motor oil. It was warm, and that was enough. He listened intently as Kaelin explained the situation, his voice a low, clipped monotone that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath. He spoke of Asset 734, the Forge Bond Protocol, the Memory Wipe, and Director Valerius. He left out the more personal details, the agony of the heat, the shared moments of vulnerability, but Silas, with his shrewd eyes, could read between the lines. He saw the way Kaelin's gaze kept flicking to Elian, the protective cant of his shoulders. He saw the way Elian sat, nestled in the commander's oversized coat, exhausted but watchful, his eyes never straying far from the Alpha. When Kaelin finished, Silas leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard. The Asset Integration Program, he mused. I remember the chatter about that. Nasty business. They were trying to weaponize the mating bond itself, create psychic leashes, soldiers who could track targets by instinct, Omegas who were little more than living, breathing, homing beacons. Most of the subjects, They didn't survive the bonding process. It shattered their minds. He looked at Elian with a new respect. You survived and escaped. Elian flinched at the description of himself as a homing beacon, the word landing with the cold weight of truth. That was what Valerius had wanted. A tool. Silas noticed his reaction. They called it forge bonding because they were trying to force something that should be organic, like flash forging a sword instead of folding the steel. It creates a blade that's incredibly sharp but brittle. One hard shock and it shatters. He looked between Kalen and Elian. Your bond. It didn't shatter. Not his. He gestured to Elian. Or yours. He gestured to Kalen. Even with the memory wipe. That's what makes you so dangerous to them. You're a success story they tried to bury. We need to get off-world, Kalen said, cutting to the chase. Can you get us out? Silas took a long sip of his drink. Getting off Xylos is easy. Staying off the consortium's grid is the hard part. They'll have flagged your biometrics, your DNA, everything. Any official port, any registered ship, you'll be picked up in seconds. He stood and walked over to a large, dusty console. But there are other ways. He tapped a few keys, and a holographic star chart flickered to life, showing a web of unsanctioned hyperspace lanes known as the Ghost Tunnels. I have a ship, Silas said, a modified freighter, fast, quiet, and its signature is registered to a defunct mining corporation from a century ago. A ghost ship for a couple of ghosts. He turned to them, his expression serious. But I can't fly it. Not with my record. One scan of me in the cockpit and they'll blow us out of the sky. I'm the mechanic, the navigator. I need a pilot, one with a clean biometric profile. His eyes landed on Elian. Elian stared back, confused. Me. I'm an archivist. I don't know how to fly a starship. You won't have to, Silas said, a glint in his eye. He pointed to Kalen. He'll fly it. Kalen shook his head. My biometrics are flagged. The moment I touch the controls, they'll know. Exactly, Silas said with a grin. The ship's identity scanner is hardwired into the pilot's interface. We can't change the ship's registration, but we can change the pilot's. Or rather, we can mask it. He walked over to a workbench and picked up a complex-looking device, a network of wires and neurosensors. This is a biometric spoofer, a very illegal, very sophisticated one. It creates a shell identity, a fake biometric profile that will fool the ship's systems, and by extension, any consortium patrol that scans us. He held it out. But it needs a host, a clean slate, someone with no criminal record, no flags, no official status in the consortium military, someone like an obscure archivist from the lower city. The plan settled into place, audacious and terrifying. Elian would be wired into the spoofer, his clean biometric data used as a template to create a fake identity. That fake identity would then be projected onto Kalen. To the ship, to the universe, it would look like Elian was the one flying. Kalen would be invisible, a ghost in the machine, his hands on the controls while Elian's identity acted as a shield. It was a plan born of desperation and genius, but it required a profound level of trust. Elian would have to link his own biometrics, his very identity, to a machine that would then be controlled by Kalen, and Kalen would have to place his and Elian's freedom entirely in the hands of Silas's volatile technology. There's a risk, Silas admitted, his tone sobering. The spoofer creates a temporary psychic link between the host and the user to keep the signal stable. It piggybacks on existing neural pathways. Given that you two, he gestured between them, already have a psychic superhighway running between you, the feedback could be intense. You'll feel what he feels, Kaelin, and he'll be in your head, Elian, more than usual. Elian looked at Kaelin. Go into his head. See past the control, past the guilt, into the core of the man. See the soldier, the grieving alpha, the man who had vowed to protect him. It was terrifying, and yet he wasn't afraid. He trusted him. He didn't know how or why, but the bond, which had once been a source of terror, now felt like an anchor of truth. He could feel Kaelin's own apprehension, his fear not for himself, but for Elian, his fear of hurting him again. I'll do it, Elian said, his voice clear and steady. Kaelin looked at him, his silver eyes searching Elian's face. He saw no hesitation, only resolve. He gave a single, sharp nod. All right. Good. Silas clapped his hands together. Because our window is closing. They've pinpointed our general location. They're deploying ground troops. We need to move. Now. Silas led them through a series of hidden tunnels, deeper into the underside, to a derelict cargo bay that smelled of rust and ozone. In the center of the bay sat the ship. It was ugly, a mismatch of parts and welded plates, but it radiated a sense of rugged power. The stray dog, as Silas called it. As they approached, a memory, sharp and vivid, struck Elian. A flashback, not to the lab, but to something else. He was a child, an orphan in the state creche, before he had been selected for the program. He remembered staring at a flickering holo vid, watching ships like this one take off into the stars. He remembered dreaming of being on one, of flying away to a place where he wasn't a number, where he could be free. He stumbled, a wave of dizziness washing over him. Kaelin was instantly at his side, his hand on his arm. Elian? I'm all right, Elian breathed, the memory fading. Just remembered something. He looked from the ship to Kaelin. The dream of his childhood was here, within his grasp. But it came with the man who had been his nightmare. The irony was so thick he could taste it. Silas was already powering up the ship, the engines whining to life. Get to the cockpit. I'll handle the pre-flight and decouple the moorings. Kaelin and Elian scrambled up the ramp and into the ship. The cockpit was as cluttered as the workshop, but the pilots' and co-pilots' chairs were clean and functional. Kaelin guided Elian into the co-pilot's seat, then began fitting the biometric spoofer over his head and arms. The neurosensors were cold against his skin. This might feel strange, Kaelin said, his voice low as he connected the final wire. The moment the device activated, the world dissolved. Elian gasped as his consciousness seemed to expand, to merge with Kaelin's. It wasn't just feelings anymore. It was thoughts, memories, sensations. He felt the cold discipline of Kaelin's training, the muscle memory in his hands as they settled on the flight controls. He felt the deep, aching grief for the first Omega, a woman named Lyra, killed in a crossfire on a border world. He felt the 3 years of lonely, hollow existence that followed. And he felt the moment in the alley, the overwhelming, cataclysmic shock of finding a scent that felt like home, a scent he thought he had lost forever. He was seeing himself through Kaelin's eyes, not as an asset, but as a miracle. Simultaneously, Kaelin felt the floodgates open from Elian's side. He felt the cold terror of the lab, the years of lonely fear, the constant, gnawing anxiety of being hunted. He felt the dull ache of the suppressants, the longing for a life that wasn't spent in hiding. He felt the sting of being forgotten, the bitterness of being a nameless ghost in his own bondmate's history. and he felt the tiny, fragile spark of hope that had ignited when Kalen had said his name. The psychic feedback was a tsunami of shared trauma and nascent emotion. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was everything. Through the overwhelming flood, Kalen heard Silas's voice over the comms. "We're clear. Go, Kalen. Go." Kalen's hands, guided by years of training, but now also by Elian's shared consciousness, flew over the controls. He could feel Elian's childhood dream of flying, and it merged with his own piloting skills, creating a strange, intuitive grace. He pushed the throttle forward. The stray dog surged with power, lifting from the floor of the cargo bay. Just as they cleared the entrance, the main doors of the bay exploded inwards. Enforcer troops stormed in, firing on the rising ship. Kalen banked sharply, the ship groaning in protest. Through their shared senses, he and Elian saw a figure standing amidst the troops, a man in a pristine grey suit, his face a mask of cold fury. Director Valerius. He raised a hand, and the soldiers ceased fire. He simply stared up at the ship, his eyes seeming to bore right into the cockpit, right into them. He knew. Kalen felt a surge of pure defiance. He met the director's gaze through the viewport and pushed the engines to their maximum. The ship shot forward, out of the derelict spaceport and into the dark, cavernous expanse of the underside. They were flying. They were free. But as they raced toward the upper atmosphere, Kalen and Elian both felt the director's parting thought. A cold, clear promise sent across the psychic static. "You cannot run from what you are. I will have my asset back." The hunt had just gone interstellar.